Hi and welcome back. Please excuse my voice, it's still a little bit croaky from having this bad flu bug for the past 2 or 3 weeks, but hopefully I'm on the way to recovery. I'm feeling a lot better and just about ready to start painting again. But I've had a request to go through my sort of go-to colours that I use and to swatch them out. So that's what today's video is going to be about. It's going to be talking about the colours that I like to use personally, my go-to regular colours, as well as the ones that I sort of pick up every now and again. And this isn't a comprehensive list. There are a few others that I do use from time to time, but this is the ones that came to mind as being the ones that I use the most often. And of course, that's for landscape painting. I have a completely different palette that I use for flower painting, but then that's something that I don't do very often. I think the landscape painting is the most interesting one to discuss. But one thing I'd like to say now is that I'm not trying to say that these are recommended colours, but just that these are the colours that I prefer and that I use. I think it's a bit of a painting myth that if you were to buy the same colours as that your favourite artist uses, that you'd be able to paint like them. And we need to sort of nip that in the bud straight away. Even those artists that use exactly the same sort of palette will mix them in a different way, will produce different blends or different ways of using the same colours together for different effects. So I think it's best to start off with quite a small range of colours, but to learn about them intimately, to play around with them, mix them, blend them, see what they look like together, separately, see what they look like at full strength and at complete dilution, and see what you can paint with them. And as you paint, you will find yourself drawn to certain colours and you'll be less keen on others. And I think that's a clue. The colours that you're drawn to are probably the ones that are going to best express what you, even if you don't realise it now, what you want to say with your watercolour painting as you learn and progress. There are so many hundreds and thousands even of different shades and hues of watercolour paint available, so it can be really confusing. And I was completely boggled when I first realised that I wanted to do watercolour painting. But I stumbled across the Ron Ranson technique online on YouTube in some demos, and then via some books I bought from eBay. So I started off using the colours that he recommended, and then I've sort of built my collection out from there. And what you see here, and what I'm going to swatch out in a minute, is my most used paints, although there are a few others. Now, the ones that Ron Ranson recommended and the ones that I started off with, I highly recommend too as a really good starting point for landscape painting. And they are as follows, and I will list them below as well for you. So the Ron Ranson colours are Raw Sienna, Ultramarine, Lemon Yellow, Paynes Grey, Burnt Umber, Alizarin Crimson and Light Red. And a little bit later on he started to use Cerulean Blue as well. So that would be a good starting point for beginners. But now let me introduce you to my most used colours and then I'll swatch them out for you. Now, this top row are my go-to colours. This is my limited palette that I rely on for nearly all of my personal paintings, sometimes subtracting or adding a few colours just according to my mood. But from left to right, the colours are as follows: Raw Sienna, Burnt Umber, Sepia, Indigo and Paynes Grey. Now, you may have noticed this is not a classic palette, but it is my signature palette. A classic palette would contain the three primary colours, a clean, bright yellow, red and a blue. Now, I don't have those, but I do have something pretty close. My Raw Sienna, which is sort of a brownish colour, works for my yellow. My Burnt Sienna works instead of a red. And my Indigo works instead of a blue. So hopefully you can see that here I'm still sort of using close to primary colours, as the basis for my main colours. And then I've got these other neutrals because my painting style is quite grungy and earthy. Of course, these days I mostly paint with our own handmade Davidson's pigment paints, but I'm not showing those here because those are only made in very small batches, so they're not widely available. So before we started making our handmade paints, I've always used mostly Cotman colours and a few others, and all of these are Cotman colours here. A couple of the blues are from Jackson's own brand, and one of the greens that I'll show you a bit later is artist quality paint from Winsor & Newton because I can't find it in the Cotman range. So let's move on and look at some of the other colours that I paint with most often. So firstly, here are the blues, the purer blues. We have Cobalt Blue and Ultramarine Blue, both of those are by Jackson's. And then Prussian Blue and Cerulean Blue, which are Cotman colours. And now on to the yellows, again from left to right. Lemon yellow hue, and then cadmium yellow hue, and then yellow ochre. Again, all Cotman colours. So that's my extra yellows, and now my reds. There's Cotman Alizarin Crimson, which is a lovely colour, and then a really bright, rich French vermilion from Jackson's, their own brand colour. And then lastly, my made-up greens, my ready-made greens. I do make up a lot of my own greens, but when I need a go-to ready-made green, I'll go from left to right, Cerulean Green, which is a Winsor & Newton artist quality paint because I can't find it in the Cotman range, and then Cotman Sap Green, which is a really nice green, easily modified, mixing with other colours to produce some really good shades. Now, just before I swatch these colours out for you, there are a few others that didn't make the cut, but that are still very useful colours nonetheless. So there's light red, there's white gouache, which is always useful for highlights at the end of a painting, cobalt violet deep, which is a really good purple, and that comes in handy sometimes. But other than that, these here are my absolute go-to colours. Well, at least for landscape painting, of course. So I'm going to swatch these out on the back of an old painting, and I'm using a 1/2-inch flat brush, which gives me, if I load it full of paint, I can get a nice long swatch, which usually goes from dark to reasonably light. Now, from top to bottom, I'm starting off with my signature limited palette first. So it's raw sienna, and this is burnt sienna. It's a lovely warm red. And then burnt umber. And in this, because my palette of choice is quite grungy, I have another brown because it's a much cooler, darker, deeper brown, and that's sepia. And then similarly, I have two fairly neutral colours, quite dark neutrals. My indigo, although indigo is a lovely mixer, either with water or with other paint. With lots of water, you will get quite a clean, clear blue. And then the final one in my signature palette is Paynes Grey, which is quite similar to indigo, but it's on the blacker side of grey, whereas indigo is on the bluer side of grey. So those are my main basic signature palette. And so now let's get on to the blues. So I'm starting off with Cobalt Blue, which is an absolute favourite of mine. I think it's pretty much the perfect sky blue as far as I'm concerned, or blue to use for the kind of skies that I see and want to paint. And this is Ultramarine Blue, which actually looks very similar here in this light to the Cobalt Blue, but there's quite a distinct difference. I'd say Ultramarine blue is a slightly sort of redder blue, if you see what I mean. It's sort of a deeper, darker colour, slightly sort of different to the cobalt. And this is Prussian blue. And that's got quite a lot of sort of yellow in it. And then lastly, Cerulean Blue, which I often use for really bright, vivid summer skies. And that kind of gives a good contrast with my grungy, sort of earthy foregrounds. So those are my blues. So let's now move on and swatch out my yellows. Now I'm going to start off with the earthy yellow, and that's yellow ochre. You can see how much sort of browner and stronger that is than the raw sienna. And then when I need to either have some really nice sort of bright cool yellows, I will use lemon yellow hue, and this is a really good one for mixing with blues and greys to make lovely landscape greens. And so is cad yellow here, which is a really warm yellow, almost on the sort of orangey side. Again, that's a great mixer for greens as well. And then here are my two reds. Firstly, my Alizarin Crimson, which is a sort of a pinker red. It's a sort of slightly bluish red, and again, a really useful mixing colour. And then my final red is French Vermilion, and that's a much more sort of yellowish, or should we say orangey red. It's really vivid, really intense, and incredibly useful when I want some just nice sort of pops of colour. And lastly, my greens. First, sap green, which you can see is actually a pretty good green to use straight out of the tube in landscapes, but you can modify it using sort of yellow, burnt sienna or raw sienna or burnt umber, and bring it down to all kinds of different shades and tones for landscapes. And lastly, Cerulean green, which is technically a black, but it's a beautiful blackish green, and it's absolutely fabulous in landscapes for getting some really nice dark tones. So here are the colours all dried and labelled. Now if you're a Patreon member, I'll be providing this and other slides for you to download and consult as necessary. For YouTube, I will list the colours in the description below, and I will also list the basic Ron Ranson palette below in case any of you are interested in using that as a starting point. So I hope that was helpful. Please let me know in the comments below what you think, and also if there are any go-to colours here that you use that I haven't mentioned here that you'd like to have a say about, and I shall look forward to reading those. But to finish off, I will just have a slideshow of some of my own personal paintings that I have painted using my favourite colours. Mostly just a few of them at a time, because I like to work, as most of you know, with quite a limited palette, quite a grungy palette, but with pops of colour. So I hope you enjoy this slideshow, and I'll see you again soon, and happy painting. Bye.